Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that here at Blaze Media, we've always stood for truth, freedom, and faith in God and country. And those aren't just words. It's a commitment we strive to live by every day. And now we want to help you carry your faith into your week wherever you are. Starting this Sunday, we're going to be launching a new series called Sunday Revival. New episodes will be available every Sunday morning for Blaze TV subscribers, and you get to hear inspiring messages from leaders like Pastor Jack Graham from Prestwood Baptist Church, Pastor Alan Jackson from World Outreach Church, Josh Howerton at Lake Point Church, Rob McCoy from Godspeak Calvary Chapel, and many more to come. Join us each week and discover additional perspectives to help you deepen your understanding and faith. Regardless of what's happening in the world, Sunday Revival is here to help you grow, staying grounded in God's word and continue to strengthen your faith. Join us this Sunday on Blaze TV and start your week with purpose, faith, and inspiration. Hey guys, you know that I've been discussing the nature of nationalism and national identity quite a bit lately, and this discussion obviously isn't just happening in the United States, it's also very prominently happening in the United Kingdom. One of the biggest issues, very strangely, that's come up is whether the English are even a real people, a real ethnicity, a real identity that one can organize a country around. I wanted to speak with someone who has himself thought deeply about these issues. He is the chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation in the UK. He's a professor at the University of Cambridge. James Orr, thank you so much for coming on.
Auron, it's great to be with you.
So I'll just start with, I guess, kind of the most basic question here. I've watched this kind of strange scandal unfold as many of your leaders struggle with just kind of the very basics of ethnos and identity. And this is in no way unique to the UK. Of course, in the United States, this is a very contentious issue. Many leaders, even conservative leaders, even right-wing leaders, are very worried about touching this topic. But I think more and more we cannot ignore the reality that this is a discussion that's going to happen across the entire Western world. So maybe for people who are not familiar, I know this is going to seem very obvious to you, but for people outside the UK, Americans who may not be familiar with really the constituencies inside the UK, can you explain what English identity would be versus, say, British identity, and what other ethnoses or identities make up the United Kingdom in their main parts?
Well, look, I'll get onto that, Auron, but I just, as you were speaking, I was reminded of that wonderful commencement address by David Foster Wallace, where he gives that wonderful joke of the goldfish going for a swim one morning and sees another goldfish, and the goldfish says, "How's the water?" And the other goldfish goes, "What's water?"
Right.
And my sense is that the reason we're so baffled and inarticulate when it comes to talking about questions of English identity and English ethnicity is that it's been the water that we've been swimming in England, in the British Isles, for 1,200 years, for 1,500 years. We just haven't had to ask the question before. What do you mean, what is water? We don't know what it is. But in the last 25 years, we've seen the effects of mass, unchecked demographic change, mass migration, and that has forced us into a kind of ethnic self-consciousness that we're very uncomfortable with here in Britain. We don't like talking about it. We've never had to talk about it. We don't know how to talk about it. And I think, to be kind of charitable to our politicians and our leaders and our leading commentators, they're as confused as the rest of us, and it's not something we're comfortable talking about, because it's not something we've ever been really comfortable talking about. If you look back, to go to the heart of your question, I mean, look back over the last 1,200 years of English history, or the history of the English, the people. Let's just say the people. From 400 to 800 AD, we have massive influxes of the Anglo-Saxons. From 800 to 1000 AD, we have a mass influx of the Vikings. In 1066, we have a few thousand Normans come along, but they really throw their weight around and start carving up the nation and imposing their tyranny upon us. And then we have, slow influxes, but, the Huguenots, the Protestant Huguenots in the 16th century from France, we welcome them in. We have quite, moderately large influxes of Irish in the 19th century. And we're not really, who are the English? I mean, the English, in many ways, the self-consciousness emerges Contrast is the mother of clarity, and it's our relationship with the Scottish, probably first and foremost, but also the Welsh, defines our sort of sense of our self-consciousness as a people, let's just say as a people rather than as an ethnicity. But you might say that the United Kingdom is born relatively recently, just maybe a few decades before the American Republic in 1707, when, as it were, England and Scotland forged that Act of Union. Ireland comes along about 100 years later. Wales is folded into England. And so there's this sort of sense of being British, which is at once a kind of a sense of, there's a deep sense of heritage there. We are people of Britannia. We are people of, we are Britons. We're people who belong to this particular place, this particular island. But also there's a sense, even before empire begins to emerge, of a sense of, well, to be British is to be a kind of part of a kind of conveniently confected identity where we don't need to talk about our distinctiveness as an Englishman or as a Welshman or as a Scotsman. And then, of course, empire, by the peak of the 19th century, we are dominating nearly a quarter of the globe. And so Britishness inevitably opens up into something, as with the Roman Empire in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, into something that is much more of a kind of a civic identity, a political and legal identity. And actually, I would say we cope with that very well. We didn't have the sort of ethnic strife and racial tensions and sort of conflicts that characterized continental Europe, or, if I may say so, the continental United States. It's only really in the last 5, 10, 15 years, just a blink and just a flash in the grand sweep of our long history that we're starting to have these questions. And they're not comfortable for us, but we've got to put them on the table, and we've got to start addressing them, because they are the most important. It is the most important issue, I think, the question of who we are, what is the first person plural. It is coming to dominate the British political landscape like nothing else.
Yeah, and we're seeing this again across many different countries, including the United States. I think the reason, as you point out, that perhaps there's a little more history, of course, ethnic conflict in the United States is we imported a large number of very different people early on, as where the UK, while certainly has other Europeans that flooding to it, really hasn't seen a large influx of non-Europeans until recently, and the contrast has been pretty stark. And I think this is one of the hard things, because when people talk about these identities, they get very scared, because, to be fair, there are very rigid one drop genetic racialists out there who want identity to just be a pure matter of blood and exactly what percentage of which background you came from, and that's the only way to understand what's going on. Traditionally, heritage has always been part of national identity. It is ultimately a nation, a true people is an expansion of the family, an extension of the family. However, there is always this, just as families can always add people through marriage and adoption and other methods, these nations always there was a permeability in what the national identity was. You could bring in a certain amount of people, they could marry in, they could adopt the religion, they could learn the language, and after many generations, they too could become part of what it meant to be that people. However, because we have become so obsessed with defining very rigidly, even the people who are the most progressive or are in theory the most worried about hatred being raised up by the creation of national identities, they are ironically the most rigid when it comes to putting everyone in a box and getting it exactly right and making sure that we categorize and manage the relationship with everyone who's got the right box checked. And this creates a situation where race becomes the salient factor, as opposed to perhaps other aspects of ethnic identity that previously dominated. And I thought that was very interesting because, of course, the left is obsessed with many of these racial identities, ethnic identities, and they celebrate many of these racial and ethnic identities. But part of the reason that this kind of English identity became a little bit of a controversy was that you had different English figures asserting, no, yes, you may be British, you may have moved here from India, your family may have come here with Windrush or whatever, but you are not English. You may be British, but English is a very specific ethnicity, and you might be part of a wider British identity, but you cannot be this. And the simple fact that someone drew a line somewhere with a identity that is European instead of African or East Asian or something, the fact that there was a category that you could not fit all of these people into. This became just a complete outrage. And so it's very difficult for people to even have basic conversations about the difference between, for instance, an ethnos or a wider imperial or national, nationalistic identity. It's very difficult for people to parse these things. And the minute that someone gets excluded, we get an extreme amount of offense, especially if those excluded are, being excluded because they are not European in some way.
Absolutely. I mean, isn't it funny that it's the way in which people talk about ethnic minorities? It's the very people who talk about ethnic minorities who want us to keep talking about ethnic minorities, who want to sacralize ethnic minorities, who want to put membership of an ethnic minority over and above membership of a common collective moral political community, who refuse to countenance talk of an ethnic majority. That is to say, the logical corollary of there being an ethnic minority is that there is an ethnic majority. But if you say that, if you try to invoke it or try to work out what the complex relationship might be between an ethnic, a dominant ethnos, and other constituent ethnic minorities, then effectively, you are cancelled from polite society. And look, these are not comfortable conversations, but we are where we are. And I sometimes think that, I think back to, for example, 2004, when here in Britain we passed the Gender Recognition Act 2004. I was at law school at the time, and I remember thinking, gosh, this is going to wire in the gender ideology effectively into English law. Is that really a good idea? I remember having that thought over 20 years ago. But I was convinced at the time by liberal friends that no, there's actually a strong liberal case for a kind of indulging in a kind of compassionate fiction for that tiny percentage of the population who just for whatever reason would feel, psychologically relieved if the British state was able just to pretend to engage in a compassionate fiction that this man was, let's say, a woman, or this woman was in fact a man. And I think where you've got a dominant ethnos, you can indulge in the kind of compassionate fiction of civic nationalism. You can say, look, yes, you're English. Just as you might say to the man who thinks he's a woman, yes, you're a woman, and we're happy to go along with that for now. But I think, and so where you've got a dominant ethnos that is not being toxified, that is not being challenged, whose history and heritage is not being trampled upon, then in fact, you probably do have, broadly speaking, propitious conditions for a kind of confected, compassionate fiction of a sort of civic nationalism where ethnicity and questions of ethnicity and race and religion can recede. And you can just about have a flourishing and integrated multi-ethnic or multi-religious community and society. But that's not what's happened. In fact, we've had a progressive elite that time and time again, over and over and over, has been demonizing the ethnos, where has been, to all intents and purposes, criminalizing or at least stigmatizing the flying of the English flag, or even indeed the flying of the Union Jack. That one symbol that kind of should transcend all political affiliations, all kind of identitarian concerns. And the worry is that once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's very hard to know how to put it back. Once the sort of the sense of English self-consciousness as one ethnicity among others in this place emerges, what's the reverse gear here? It's not obvious. And I look ahead with some foreboding as I see riots breaking out all over the country, here, even today in England. And over the last couple of days, we've been seeing St. George's flags being put up, Union Jacks being put up, and some councils trying to take them down, saying that this is not conducive to community cohesion. Palestinian flags are fine, Ukrainian flags are fine. Every nationalism is fine except our own expression of loyalty to our own nation. So, we're in very, very sort of tense times, I would say, to understate matters somewhat.
So there's an interesting parallel again between the U.S. and the U.K. in this way, but it doesn't apply to every Western country that is undergoing this experience. So you pointed out that English identity has to become British identity as you expand out, bring in more kingdoms, and then as you become an empire and you're managing many peoples across the globe, there's another layer of this. Happened to the Romans. U.S. similar experience. We more or less got handed the baton of the British Empire after World War II, and have ourselves found that we are in many ways losing this understanding, because just as you guys are experiencing, we started, we've always had a decent amount of immigration to the United States, but we really started bringing vast amounts of people from radically different places. And again, with your analogy of the fish and water, being wet, we slowly recognize that these other groups are leveraging their racial solidarity, their ethnic identities, whether we recognize ourselves as a people or not. And so this raises the salience of race and identity in the society, as you say, when there's this more or less uniform understanding of what England or what the United States was. Then a few people who come in, it's not a big deal. You can kind of do your thing, and we can try to include you because we're very confident in who we are. We're very familiar with that. This isn't going to disrupt our way of life. But so many people are now vying for so many pieces of the pie that there's really not much left other than for you to recognize that you're actually now in a competition. You're no longer the dominant ethnos or the dominant identity inside of this, and you more or less dictate where things are going. You have to become one of these people who's squabbling over the different aspects of, institutions and power and religion and all these things. And we've seen this in other societies. We know that, there are multi-ethnic empires that manage themselves during this, but they usually do it by separating these peoples, giving them all kind of their own jurisdiction inside their area, and then kind of bringing it all together under a king, an emperor, some figurehead who can negotiate between these different peoples. But that's fundamentally different from kind of the nation state understanding that we have had the last few hundred years in the modern world. And so I wonder, do you think that it's the empire itself that creates this scenario? Because there are other countries like, Australia, obviously they were part of the empire, but there's no, greater Australia that's going to be pushing its way somewhere into Mongolia anytime soon. So why are we seeing this in all these European countries, some which had empires and can buy into this narrative, but others never experienced this?
Yeah, no, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think over in 1948, in the post-war period where we pass our first sort of Citizenship Act, National Citizenship Act, we've got maybe 98, 99% of the British, of Britain is broadly speaking ethnically British, ethnically English, ethnically Scottish. And then over the course of the 1950s and 60s, broadly speaking, we have a very successful, relatively sort of balanced inflows of migrants from West Pakistan, as it then was, from India, from sub-Saharan Africa. And generally speaking, they integrated quite successfully because there was this sense of being a subject of empire, having benefited from the fruits of one of the most successful empires that the world has ever known. And so, they wanted to make the trek from far away to our, rainy little island with terrible food and spending time with people with terrible teeth and in rationing and a kind of war-torn Britain. And they did that because there was a sense of signing up to the values, to what it was to be British, as an identity that transcended race, that transcended ethnicity, that transcended religion. And that project, to some extent, worked pretty well, at least if you compare it to the track record of other post-colonial empires and their efforts at assimilation. Think of France, for example, and all the terrible troubles that France has had with its aggressive doctrine of secularity with respect to integrating Muslims from the Maghreb and North Africa. But I think, as that sort of sense of repudiation of empire and the imperial legacy has got more aggressive and more intense, we've lost that sort of mechanism to articulate the monoculture. The monoculture, it seems to me, monoculturalism is the only way that you're going to be able to integrate a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial moral community, a moral and political community. And what does liberalism give us? The very opposite. It fetishizes, sacralizes multiculturalism, and that has been a complete catastrophe. And because that's what sort of generated these silos. And of course, it's not just multiculturalism; it's what my dear friend Eric Kaufman, a great sociologist here in Britain, calls asymmetric multiculturalism. That is to say, equality only goes in one direction. That is to say, it is a kind of a kind of sacred status for ethnic minorities, and the very opposite, a stigmatized status for the dominant ethnos. And that is a recipe for social chaos. It's a recipe for dissent. It's a recipe for conflict, for the dissolution of trust. And so, I don't know if we could have made it work, but certainly the very worst path we could have taken was embracing the doctrine of multiculturalism. That was, as it were, the only thing that could really have made everything work is the sort of a sense of a shared horizon, a common culture. And broadly speaking, a post-imperial monoculture could have worked. In effect, what we're seeing now is that the British Isles, the British Empire is being replicated within the British Isles. You talked earlier about how empires can be multicultural, but they require, carefully delineated and segregated demographic silos. And in fact, I think that is probably what we're beginning to see here in Britain. We're seeing, as it were, the British Empire condensed, distilled in microcosm onto our tiny island. And so that, there are certain parts of the country now, certain parts of certain urban centers that are completely dominated by Islam. And it is very clear that you're not welcome if you are not a Muslim. There are parts of certain cities where it's very clear that you're not going to be welcome if in a Hindu area, and so on and so forth. And of course, that will drive the emergence of a sense of English ethnic self-consciousness. And I think that's, it's heartbreaking. And I think there might have been a way we could have made it work. But politicians have got a huge job on their hands now. And I think the government, looking at the British government now, it's clearly in a state of complete paralysis. The Tory party hasn't got any ideas. Reform UK has got some promising ideas. And I think it's got a sense of Britishness. It's got a sense of national confidence, national preference, putting the nation first, which is transcending race, transcending ethnicity. So we'll have to wait and see how Nigel Farage and Reform UK do. But we've got the politicians have got an enormous job in their hands.
I too I've struggled with this issue quite a bit because innately, just being a good classic talk radio American conservative, like, yeah, of course we can do the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, not going to be a problem. We won't call it multiculturalism. We'll call it something else. But the more I look at this, the more I wonder, especially when it comes to religion, because I think of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and the way that he understands, these civilizational blocks that are mainly defined by the religions that in those regions. He identifies that as the core binding agent for different peoples. And I mean, can you ultimately have a shared culture between religions with very different values? And I don't mean that we can't, you can have 10 Muslims gathering together somewhere. You can have a Hindu service in a, community center where it's not the end of the world. But I mean, can you really operate a shared culture when people have fundamentally different, their entire world view is radically different, the way that they understand knowledge, the way that they approach learning and rule of law and the role of men and women and everything else? Can you really have a shared culture when you don't have that binding agent of religion? I think in the UK, I mean, obviously this is happening everywhere, but it feels like in the UK, it's specifically vulnerable to this scenario because it's a very atheistic society at this point. It's a very secular society. And so that all attempts to bind you together on some kind of shared value outside of just literally skin color, well, you don't have a religion to do that. You don't have something that can actually move across those communities. And so the only thing to do is to adopt some kind of free-floating propositional, we've got British values thing, but that's only skin deep. At the end of the day, a Muslim is going to be a Muslim before they're British. A Hindu is going to be a Hindu before they're British. And the British don't know what to be because they're not Christian anymore. And so it feels like that is itself a huge issue, because I am more and more skeptical about the idea that even the civic nationalism based on this, like, just, free floating idea of shared values somewhere, either in the United States or Britain, is actually a way to bind people of very different actual cultures together.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, in many ways, English culture, when we talk about English culture, we just are talking about Christian culture. The very first history and the dominant kind of history of the English of the English people is Bede's history of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. That's as it were, to be English, to England. What stitched England together was this sense of a kind of common Christian inheritance. And Alfred the Great, typically seen as our first, our founding king, the founding king of England, is very self-consciously a Christian king. He sees England as a Christian dominion, and that runs through the centuries. And so I think you're right that it's very, very difficult to separate out questions of religion from questions of culture. And so what are we trying to do? Yes, at the moment, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've entered into what you might say is a post-Christian phase in Britain. And we are dominated by the dogmas of liberalism, in particular Rawlsian liberalism, that insists that we must bracket all of what Rawls calls our comprehensive metaphysical doctrines, as it were, for the sake of civic peace in the public square. We cannot invoke the kinds of fundamental questions that religion is so good at addressing, because if we do, then we're going to be in a state of conflict, and everything's going to unravel. And so you've got that kind of agnostic nervousness and neuralgia around these kind of questions of deep fundamental questions that are never going to go away. There's that old line that Christianity always, or religion always, buries its undertakers. You may try and drive it out from the front door, but it's always going to come rushing in through the back door. And the fact of the matter is that there is a sense that with the passing of Christianity and the rise of a sort of culture of what Roger Scruton calls of self-repudiation, there's a kind of civilizational exhaustion. And we're bringing in extraordinary, unprecedented numbers, people from different parts of the world who do have a deep commitment to the transcendent. In the case of Islam, who have a deep commitment to the Ummah that will always supersede, will always transcend any local national loyalties. And that's the same with other religions too. I mean, it's especially true of Islam. That's not to say that Muslims can't be, dedicated and successfully integrated members of the British polity. But it's an enormous challenge, particularly when people are coming in at scale, and particularly when there isn't any kind of rival set of norms and orientations and horizons that could substitute for religion, or at least to some extent supersede it or domesticate that deep impulse towards the Ummah, in the case of Islam, or in the case of Hinduism towards India. To be a Hindu, Hinduism is deeply rooted in a particular place in the subcontinent. What does a British Muslim do 5 times a day? He works out where Mecca is. That is to say, he physically orientates himself towards a place that is not Britain.
Right.
And and that's not just that's not an incidental obligation within Islam. It's one of the 5 pillars. That is what you've got to do every day. Orientate yourself away towards a center of gravity, a center of geographic gravity, as it were, that is the Arabian Peninsula. So liberalism simply can't cope. Secular liberalism can't cope, hasn't got a story, hasn't got any unifying horizon that can integrate these different demographic groups. And I think that's why you're seeing across the political landscape, not just in Britain, but all across the West, particularly in Europe. I mean, perhaps it's less so in America, where, broadly speaking, your migration inflows have been Hispanic Catholics. And I think that has actually made life a lot easier for you than it has been for us. But it's an enormous headache, and I don't think there's any solution to it.
You mentioned Rawlsian liberalism there, and it's kind of amazing to me that people are still pitching the original position and the veil of ignorance, when I feel like Carl Schmitt dismantled this pretty handily with the friend-enemy distinction in the first place. It's very clear that ultimately there are lines on which these communities are willing to die and kill for their identity, and that those things don't suspend themselves just because you've imported into them the magic soil of the West that will wash away all these commitments and bring this forward. But I do want to push back a little bit, because you said there, well, of course a Muslim can integrate and become part of English society. but I'm not sure. Like I'm genuine, and I'm not trying to bag on anyone here, but again, as you describe, to be Muslim is to worship another place and to hold always and forever that place in your heart. You cannot be a faithfully practicing Muslim and not worship a far off land for generations. Not just you, but your children and your grandchildren must worship it. I mean, this was literally the concern of Americans when we started importing, the Italians and the Irish, because they were Catholic and they brought all that popery over there. There's going to be this European king, that you're actually loyal to. There's this European authority in the old world that you're trying to, and you'll, sign yourself up for generations of this. And of course, eventually that faded, but it took many, many, many generations for that to occur. And also, in a large part, many of those people either converted to Protestantism, or they modified their Catholicism in a way that allowed them to be more compatible with American culture. But I'm not sure that this is even true of Islam. I mean, Catholicism and Protestantism are, at least, we're still both in Christianity. We're at least somewhere in the same realm. But Islam is just not that. And so I'm sure there are individual people, one
Yeah.
who ultimately work their way into English society and become. But as a group, it does seem very specifically that if you are allowing Muslim immigration into your country, you are necessarily creating a fifth column. That even if these people aren't malicious, and many of them are, but even if they aren't malicious, just the natural pull of their social organization will always keep them out necessarily of British society. And that is going to create a barrier to any attempt to reunify your identity and move forward together as a nation.
You're absolutely right that the speed and scale of migration from Muslim majority countries that we're seeing at the moment means that there's simply no incentive for new arrivals from Muslim majority countries to integrate at all, to learn English, to have anything to do with, as it were, indigenous British culture. That's absolutely true. And you reach certain tipping points where, what is it to integrate in Bradford, integrate into being a Bradfordian? Probably to convert to Islam at this point, given the speed and scale of demographic change. But I'd push back on you a little bit, just to say that, just as with John F. Kennedy, Catholic, but he becomes president in 1960, or even the great Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe. He is a Catholic, well, to some extent anyway, but clearly not really.
Technically, yeah.
Clearly, technically, and then we have an actual Catholic in J.D. Vance, your vice president and your next president. And so now, and you're right that Catholicism, Protestantism, that kind of they hang together in a way that Christianity does not quite hang together with Islam. But I've noticed certainly there are individual Muslims. I mean, I'm thinking of Reform UK, some of the people that are at the top there. I'm thinking of Layla Cunningham, or Zia Yusuf. They are kind of political superstars within the Reform UK movement. They are Muslims. I mean, I don't know much about their sort of personal sort of journeys of faith, but they are, I think, self-identified as Muslims. But I know that they're committed to Britain. They're committed to saving the nation. They're committed to its flourishing. And so I know as success stories of individual Muslims who I would see as committed to the project of British flourishing as I am. But you're right. At the individual level, it's possible. But when you've got this immigration happening at scale, it becomes much, much harder. The example I think of actually is a biblical one. I was reading the book of Ruth earlier this week, and it's a fascinating text. I'd read it before several times, but I was rereading it, and I was having to do some speech over in America, and I thought to myself, this is the kind of the model, and this is how it can work, but the thresholds are so high. Ruth, she's a Moabitess, this sort of part of this kind of this hated enemy of Israel, but she does manage to integrate. But what does she need? What is it that she famously says? Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, like total identity, and your God will be my God.
And that last one, I think, is very important.
That's very important. But here's the interesting thing. I had not noticed this before. Even at the end of that book, very short book, she doesn't become Ruth the Israelite. She's still Ruth the Moabite. So the identity is not erased, but there is a sense that somehow the adoption kind of works, that it's not subversive. It can happen. But my worry is, it's rare. It can happen. It has happened in this nation in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We had a Hindu prime minister, Rishi Sunak. I mean, he was a year below me at school in the 1990s when we were at school together. It never crossed my mind that he wasn't English. As it were,
I think it crossed his mind.
It's certainly now crossed his mind, but because these questions have just become a lot more salient as the demographics have changed. But it didn't matter when you had a dominant, confident ethnos. It was possible to engage in that compassionate fiction that we were all in this together because we were all in it together, and we didn't need to ask those kinds of questions simply because the configuration of the different, the configuration of the ethnos was such that we could welcome in Ruths, and we could still even call them Moabites and kind of pretend that they were Israelites.
Because I don't think that ethnos is just genetic or something like this. I am 100% agree with you that you can fold new people into an identity. But I just think it takes a more total commitment. I think the Ruth example is a good example because she is her God. His God becomes her God. That is and if you look at many ancient cultures, look at Fustel Calange's The Ancient City. He talks about how when a woman leaves her family because it's all ancestor worship at that time, she's basically abandoning her religion and joining the religion of her husband. That's how she becomes part of his tribe. That's how she marries and she converts, right? These are the things that we know help to change her identity, right? And if you're not doing that, if you're entering into a community, and again, I'm sorry, but Catholicism and Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism are just much closer than Islam. I think that ultimately, if you allow, again, certain individuals, you're going to be okay. But if you allow any moderate amount of immigration of people who retain that faith and do not convert and do not make that commitment that your people will be my people and your God will be my God, they will have a different culture. They must. That it is the definition of what a culture is. If they maintain that faith to have a different one. And so I guess, my point is just, I agree that people can join these identities. And I think the keys are really intermarriage and faith. These are the things that actually throughout history have brought different peoples into being one people. But when we're not doing that, and we're actually explicitly saying it's okay if you don't do that, and not only are we not, you can serve as a government minister, and you can accumulate a large amount of power in society and maintain this alien identity. I think we're opening ourselves up for this kind of attack. I know we both know individual people who hold other faiths that we enjoy their company and value them as people, and see the contributions that they make in our society. But I think as a general principle, I think we should be demanding. Ultimately, I know that can't happen now because we can't even get to the point where we can even notice that we have a religious identity in many Western countries. But since we're just talking about what could happen in the future anyway, I think it does have to become a certain level feature of integration that you recognize that it's going to be a multi-generational thing. Like you said, Ruth does not immediately become an Israeli. She is in a way, and her children's children's children will be, right? But she is not, because you can't just become an Israeli in your first generation. You can't just become an American in your first generation. You can't just become someone who's British in your first generation. It's multi-generational. It requires you to intermarry into the culture, not to segregate yourself into ethnic ghettos. And I think ultimately it has to be some way a conversion to the religion of that people. Because if you don't have that, then you never have the spiritual enjoining. And if you never have the spiritual enjoining, you certainly won't have the cultural enjoining. You will always be set apart. You will always be looking for people of your faith to marry. You're not going to intermarry, right? To maintain those foreign identities, you in some way have to reject the local identity. And so I'm just very concerned that even as people are trying to find their way towards a true definition of national identity, they're trying to retain so much of their liberalism that they're cutting off like key markers of identity that actually show integration and actually show you a way forward for a bonding identity.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've got to say, Auron, I'm not used to being anything other than the most pessimistic person in a conversation. But
I
mean,
often steal that title. I appreciate that.
my remarks earlier was simply more just sort of running the counterfactual of how we might have gone about it. I mean, I'm not even that confident that we could have had, 100,000 Ruths a year. I'm just not sure we could have pulled it off. It would have required an enormous degree of civilizational or kind of national confidence in a monoculture. I mean, I think if anyone could have pulled it off, probably Britain could have pulled it off in the 50s and 60s, because I think actually, the sort of the imperial legacy for most of our subjects was a broadly positive one. And that's why, many people wanted to come and live here, despite the kind of not very kind of the unprepossessing conditions of our rainy island with terrible food, because there was a sense that they could buy into the institutions, they could buy into the values, and that somehow, their Islam or their Hinduism was somehow kind of compatible within this broader project. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical that we could have pulled it off. I'm not quite sure how we might have done, but I think, if any empire, where do these sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious sort of polities work? Where are they successful? Well, I suppose you might say the Roman Empire to some extent. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was pretty successful. I think the British Empire was quite successful too. But there's this great paradox that the emergence of nationalism goes hand in hand with the emergence of liberalism, as it were. Kind of two phenomena that you would have thought are kind of opposed. The liberal doctrine of human nature is of kind of refusal of all unchosen obligations and loyalties and political affections, doesn't seem to sort of sit very well with the emergence of the nation and the nation state that happens just as liberalism is emerging. You think, it's this weird way that, France, the nation, is born to some extent as we know it now in 1789. You think of the revolutions, the great national revolutions of 1848, and so on and so forth. You think of the emergence of Germany in 1870, or the emergence of Italy in 1860. So there's this kind of strange phenomena where, kind of the sort of doctrines of human nature and doctrines of of autonomy, of self-legislation, and of rights, and so on. Those only seem to flourish within a context of a kind of a breaking away from empire and an anchoring in a sort of concrete place, of concrete belonging. And it's a kind of a strange paradox. But I mean, it's one that we've been wrestling with for a long time. I mean, I'm heading off to Greece. I'm taking my family to Greece in a few days' time, and been reading a lot about 5th century Athens and the Peloponnesian War. And one of the funny things that's going on in the Peloponnesian War is that in the conflict between Athens and Sparta is that you've got loyalty to the polis, right? You're loyal to Corinth, you're loyal to Thebes, you're loyal to Athens, you're loyal to Sparta. But also you've got an ethnic component to the division. You've got the Dorian ethnicity, and you've got the you might call the sort of Ionian ethnicity. So the Athenians are Ionians, the Spartans broadly are Dorians. And broadly speaking, the kind of Peloponnesian War is both an ethnic one. The city-states line up, roughly speaking, along ethnic boundaries, and they're kind of dimly conscious of a kind of polis membership and an ethnos membership, and sometimes it crosses over, sometimes it doesn't. But it has it has really a sort of really tectonic impact on the geopolitical landscape that they're often not really conscious of.
You mentioned previously that there was a rise in the salience of ethnic identity, the rise in the salience of English as an identity, and you lamented it in some way. And I understand that on some level, because of course, you just want a harmonious society at the end of the day. I just want what's best for America. You want what's best for England. And ultimately, we want to see our homes be peaceful and get along. And, I'm not looking for my neighbors to go hunting each other down based on the color of that's a nightmare scenario, right? No one's looking for Rwanda here. At the same time, though, a lot of what I hear on the right, when terrible things happen to, say, the English or white Americans in the United States, the response of the right is you have to stop this now, or you'll see these people recognize their identity. right? That it's never that we were being terrible to the English people. It's never that we were being terrible to white Americans. That's not the crime. That's not what you should be worried about. The only reason you should be worried or change anything is those people might notice they're being mistreated and then begin to act accordingly as a group, right? That's the big thing everyone is scared about. And it's interesting because you've outlined a couple times here that identity in many ways is almost, and back to the Carl Schmitt again, but identity is forged in the outgroup attacking, right? Whether it be these two Greek ethnicities or the Greeks coming together to eventually fight the Persians because they realize that Hellenic civilization is itself like this, macro identity that they need to suddenly defend against. You have this with the Americans, obviously, with throwing off the British, are we different states or are we one unified people? We only know when we have to go to war with someone. And so over and over again, we see that it is conflict. Shared conflict is one of the things that really either, it decides where, because of course, identity is always, it's always the stack. There's always these different factors involved in identity, and whether you're focusing on ethnicity or race or in between tends to be who you're in conflict with. What is the salient identity at that moment? But as these nations start targeting their home populations, you mentioned the ethnic English. For many people, the assertion that there even was an ethnic English was itself offensive. Is that the worst thing, that people are raising that consciousness, or is that ultimately a necessary self-defense mechanism, or is it neither good or bad? It is just an inevitable outcome of where we're at, and we simply have to deal with the fact that is going to be the new reality going forward.
Well, I think that it's probably inevitable, and maybe that we, the English, and we, the British, have been shielded to some extent from the kind of sharp edge of geopolitical conflict that has characterized continental Europe in the last 500-600 years. So, to some extent, the county of Hampshire, for example, here in England, is older than every modern, every European state. And so we're a very, very sort of, it's been a very, very sort of settled landscape, a settled polity, a settled demos, a settled ethnos, and a pretty unruffled one. Yes, we've had we've been engaged in enormous international conflicts, and yes, that's kind of sharpened our sense of self-identity. And so I think now, over the last 25 years, as we've seen, more people arrive in these islands by a factor of 3 or 4 than arrived in the first 1,200 years of our history. We just don't know what to do. And, slowly, fitfully, we were never particularly, as a nation, jingoistic or unduly kind of patriotic, generally speaking, quite a kind of reserved, stiff upper lip, shy kind of, retiring people, not wanting to, think of the French, they're so sort of irritatingly jingoistic and patriotic, and they've got that kind of fierce national pride. They still do in some ways. And we've never quite had that. And so we're not used to articulating it. And it's very strange to see now on the streets of Essex today and yesterday, or the streets of towns all across the country, St. George's flags going up. This is a symbol still for many on the liberal left, a symbol of hate, a symbol of kind of conflict, a symbol of kind of, and you've actually got city councils pulling down those flags in a way that they would never dream of doing for a Palestinian flag, or a Ukrainian flag, or indeed a Scottish flag. And so, I don't know where this goes, Auron. I mean, I'm filled with foreboding. I don't know what the political solutions are. I don't think that there are any kind of, religious or sort of, ecclesiastical kinds of solutions. It's not as if we have, we do technically have a national church, but it has been absent, entirely absent for the national conversation, not able in any way to kind of stitch us together. I think at its best, Christianity is pretty good. I think probably the best religion there is at engaging in productive kind of integrating dialogue with other religions. But it just simply has not helped us at all. In fact, quite the reverse. it seems to be sort of accelerating sort of a kind of the demographic, the emergence of demographic silos, and not in any way appealing to Christianity as some kind of unifying horizon that might integrate us. So I think think the mood is pretty grim here in the British Isles, and I know you came over back in February, and I think you probably picked up that mood when you were over, and can't see where the reverse gear here is. I don't see how we slow down this train, and I think we genuinely are, politically speaking, at a kind of a point without any real historical precedents to learn from, at least as far as we're concerned, here in Britain. And it's going to take some very adept politicians. It's going to take it's going to take a counter elite to think very hard about where we go from here. But as I said, the immediate outlook is pretty grim.
Yeah, I've been to England a few times now, and the last time when, like you're saying, we were at the conference, Jordan Peterson's conference. I'm suddenly forgetting the name of it.
The ARC conference, Alliance of Responsible Citizenship. Yes, back in February. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a very strange dichotomy because, on the main stage, a lot of people, I could tell they felt like they were being very edgy by saying that, like, we think that Britain might have Christian values. Like they thought that was like a very bold move, and that was a big theme. And I'm glad to see that theme because I do think that's important. I'm glad to see that there's an acknowledgement of that by many people who have otherwise been scared to say that out loud and believe that. At the same time, when I went to a panel on restoring Christian culture, and one of these dinner panels that they had, and there were several Australian former prime ministers talking about, we of course we're a Christian country, and of course that's our identity, and that's how we're going to forge these things forward. And the first guy to get up to ask a question said, "Okay, but the majority of people who are religious in Australia already are Muslim, and we're importing more Muslims than we are any other religion. So how are we going to be a Christian country if the majority of people who are religious are a different religion?" And the response of the Australian prime ministers was, "Oh, well, we just won't. Like, we're never going to actually have a Christian culture. We'll have to be multicultural." Even though they had just spent the entire conference preaching exactly this point. And then I spoke with a lot of the young people, and that's a whole different set, right? Like that, they are much, much more radical than the people who are on the stages. And they're saying, we need a strong man. We need, we need a Franco. Like they are not pulling any punches. Things are dire. It has to change immediately. And so it just seems like there's a very, the same thing. There's a level of this in the United States. There's definitely you can tell millennials and younger have a radically different understanding of right-wing politics than Gen Xers or boomers in the United States. But I think it's even more drastic, the kind of difference between young and old in England. And I'm just worried because there's so little time, I think, with kind of what is happening here to get ahead of what's coming. And the people in charge in many of the other Commonwealth countries besides the United States really are missing that. Like, their young people are looking for very aggressive and radical leadership, while they kind of pussyfoot around with how many millions of Muslims they can import every year without tearing their country apart. And that makes them radically right wing. It just seems like a very big disconnect.
Well, look, all the Abrahamic religions are, in their own way, universal religions. And so, it would be perfectly possible to welcome in, as we have done to some extent, populations from sub-Saharan Africa that are Christian. Like a lot of African Christians from the Commonwealth countries and former colonial countries, and is that the way to recover our national identity? Is Nigerian Christianity or kind of Kenyan Christianity? If we bring in 10 million Nigerian Christians, is that going to help us be more English, be more British? No, because English Christianity is not Nigerian Christianity. It's a distinct kind of Christianity. So I think
Americans have this problem with importing Hispanic Catholics. Many Catholic leaders in the United States are like, well, of course we're for open borders because that gets us more Catholics. But yeah, that doesn't solve your problem either.
Exactly right. This is the kind of the Adrian Vermeule line, and it's not quite as straightforward as that. It's not as if Christianity is really the answer here. And so, we're in this kind of terrible bind. It's not, I think you're right, and I'm right to say that Christianity is an absolutely non-negotiable constitutive ingredient in what it is to be English, and I think in what it is to be a settler American, and yet it's a particular form, expression of this universal religion that is sedimented, over many centuries in kind of the parish church traditions, in particular hymns, in particular liturgies. In our case, in the Book of Common Prayer. I mean, it's absolutely kind of integral to our understanding of English Christianity, and to some extent, we've exported that all around the world. And so there is a great deal of commonality between, say, a sort of black majority churches in South London and St. Paul's Cathedral, a service at St. Paul's Cathedral, and yet you don't. Black majority churches are not black majority churches; they're completely black. I once went to one or two of those services, and they're just they are silos. They are demographic silos. So it's not clear to me that kind of religion is the answer necessarily. I think it's part of the picture, and I think also Islam presents a set of quite sui generis challenges, because I think it's unusually resistant to integration into a sort of distinct particular sort of national polity, so I noticed those dynamics at the conference too, and that there was a kind of the tensions between the boomers and the zoomers. I talked to my Zoomer friends on the right who, some of them are passionate Catholics. Very few of them are still Anglicans, but others are actually, they think religion is part of the problem, that Christianity is part of the problem. That when a bishop comes out and says, "Look, it is the Christian thing to do to open your borders, to welcome the stranger," and so on and so forth. It's the kind of the Spengler line or the Nietzschean line that actually, Christianity has got the sort of, it's within it, it's got these ideas that are, if they're not properly handled and integrated theologically, can be can sort of metastasize into the sort of hyper progressivism that we're seeing, the valorizing of victimhood, opening up the borders and being kind of blind to Galatians 3:28, we're all one in Christ Jesus, and any other kind of ethnic distinctions or any sorts of distinctions are to be dissolved. And so, in some ways, I think for the young people at the art conference, some of them very committed, others actually thinking maybe Christianity is what got us here.
Yeah, there's certainly some of that in the United States as well, though I think it's a very, very small subset. The pagan or Nietzschean right it's a very particular group, and some of them I'm friends with, some of them I'm even allies with. But at the end of the day, they don't have a real community, right? There's no living pagan tradition that they're involving themselves. No. The Nietzscheans don't have any way to build a resilient culture that's going to allow them to forge a society that can actually push back against any of this stuff. And I took some heat recently, but I said, look, the pagans and the Nietzscheans, they're just subversive. There's just subversive guys who are opening the gates for Islam or Hinduism or something else. Because when you dismantle the real belief, the organic belief, the transcendent belief of your society, what happens isn't they don't all just become enlightened, supermen like you. What happens is someone else's metaphysical dominance rolls over your society. And so, I think you're right that those people exist. I understand some of their points. And of course, as you point out, when you have bishops or you have pastors, misquoting these lines from the Bible and portraying the idea that the Bible just dissolves all nations and ethnicities, which it absolutely does not. Just read a book of Revelation if you'd like to, see the actual just direct
Matthew 28.
Right.
Yeah.
But ultimately, these people just can't forge a society on their own. Whether they like it or not, Christianity is going to be part of that identity. Like you said, it's not sufficient, but it is necessary. And I think that's going to be the case going forward. And we could probably talk about this for another hour, but I know you're like trapped in a bar right now because of your train delay. So I don't want to keep you forever. We do have some questions from the audience, though, if you have a few minutes to run through those real quick.
Sure thing.
All right. So before we go there, is there anything that you want to let people know about? Any books, conferences, work you want to direct people for, social media, anything you want people to check out before we go to the questions of the people?
Well, gosh, I wasn't expecting that question, Auron, but since you asked it, let this be the an international announcement of a podcast that I've started recording called First Light, and it's going to be out in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. I'm going to get into trouble with my producer here, but yeah, so First Light is a podcast that is looking at questions at the intersection of faith and of politics and of culture, with a particular focus on Britain, but looking across the Atlantic as well. We've recorded some fantastic conversations. They're going to start to be released in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. So First Light with James Orr. It'd be great to go. So look it up in about a month's time.
Fantastic breaking news here on the podcast. Make sure to check out James's work when we see that roll off the assembly line. All right, guys, heading over to the questions of the people here. Weird E Curb says, I've been hoping I'd see you on Tucker sometime soon. Super stoked for you, man. Hope you see audience growth from it. Well, thank you very much, guys. Yeah, if you didn't catch it, I was on Tucker Carlson here today. A lot of fun, very interesting conversation. So if you want to check that out, it's up over at his channel now. Base Tillbilly says, immigration has been a scourge since the 1066. Obviously, this is a long-standing problem for any society. It's not like the United States or the UK simply, invented the idea of immigration problems. The Romans famously had massive, immigration problems. Entire civilizations are wiped out by immigration problems. So this is just a part of history that you have to deal with. We're unique in that the way we're kind of doing it to ourselves, and at the scale and speed we're doing it. The technology has increased the rapidity at which you can make this mistake. However, that does not make it somehow different, I think, from many of the ways that you had to deal with it in the past. So.
Let me just add to that, Auron, that 1066, the kind of invasion by the Normans of William the Conqueror, in a way, wasn't really immigration. It was just an invasion by a relatively small number of Norman French mercenaries. And yes, they did terrible damage to England in many ways, but they reorganized it in lots of other ways. But in terms of kind of actual demographic change, it was, more like an occupation where, the ethnos, the Anglo-Saxons, absorbed pretty successfully the relatively small slice of Normans who arrived. And what we're seeing now is very, very different in terms of scale and complexity.
Yeah, important thing to point out. Absolutely. Paladin YYZ says, once I stunned a crowd at a bar by sinking a 4-9 ball and a 3-8 ball on the break. I was lucky and drunk and in the zone. You, sir, just did what you do. He handed you the cue and effortlessly sunk the ball, waiting for the next guy to put his quarters in. Amazing job, Auron. Well, thank you very much, man. I really appreciate that. You guys have been incredibly kind with your support, and I really appreciate you guys watching and just keeping us doing what we're doing here. Base Telebilly says, we're all Rhodesia now. We can't negotiate. Well, I mean, there is that's a much larger discussion, right? But there is also a concern by many people, and we're certainly watching it in the United States here. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but one of the many narratives around Rhodesia is that the native Black population had a large difficulty of maintaining the standard of living that had been erected in that country once they gained control. And this is something that a process that's also being seen in South Africa, similar breakdown to a country that was once had its own space program, I think, at least nukes, right? And now it has a difficult time keeping the power on and keeping any level of civil order. In the United States, we're seeing a generation of people who in many ways can't maintain a lot of the complex systems that undergird our society. Again, I know this could be its own episode, but what do you think about that danger of not having enough people integrated and then trying to hand off a civilization for them to maintain when they don't even necessarily value it, much less understand many of the nuances of how it's maintained?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of the great myths of progressivism, that civilization, that we're just always going to get more civilized, and technology is always going to improve. We're always going to get better at wielding it, and just life is always going to get better. And that's just, there is no law of nature or law of history that determines that. I mean, one historical precedent that comes to mind is when the Romans withdrew from these islands in 410, the first half of the 5th century. AD. And if what happened was, well, we Brits lost central heating for nearly 1,000 years. We just forgot. We just didn't know how to do it. And I think it would have been very strange to be a Brit in kind of 550, 600 AD, surrounded by the kind of the architectural ghosts of this long lost empire. A world that was, where you could, all these extraordinary things were built. A world in which your house was heated, and civilization can go backwards as well as forwards. The progressive mind can't cope with that, and so therefore it can't factor it in as a risk. It can't factor in, the kind of the competence crisis, as it's called, or civilizational loss, or a kind of technological stagnation and deterioration. But it is something that can happen just in a generation. All it takes is to lose, one generation of Boeing engineers, and that company, it's kind of over. And so it's something that it's something that's deeply concerning, and requires a kind of ruthlessly meritocratic approach to talent formation, talent spotting. And I think, again, the liberal progressive mind that is sort of fetishizing diversity, equality, and inclusion above all else is just not equipped to cope with the risks of civilizational collapse.
Well, this is something that Spengler was right about, is that ultimately science is not some abstract thing that you just add to indefinitely. It is owned by peoples. It is practiced by peoples. And if the people lose their passion for it, if they don't invest their best minds in it, if they don't perpetuate the tradition, then just because someone figured out some science somewhere doesn't mean you get to keep it. Like, you can lose it all. It can be gone for centuries. You guys still haven't figured out central cooling, so that's... I'm always making fun of the British and their lack of air conditioning. But
it took us a long time. But to be honest, frankly, the number of days where it's hot enough in this country to actually need air conditioning is kind of, not many.
No, it's very true. I remember I was over. I had to go to Oxfordshire, and I was at a hotel there, and they were apologizing to me because we know it's just a blistering hot summer, and we don't have any air conditioning, and we're so sorry. And it was about 20 degrees cooler than where I had just come from in Florida. So I was laughing. I was sitting there with a window open. I'm living a dream here. This is amazing. If I could get a summer like this at home, I would just lose my mind. But all right. So we got Michael Robertson here. He says, great discussion, guys. Auron, you absolutely killed it on Tucker interview. Excellent overview of everything in this space. Great job. Thank you again, guys. Really appreciate that. It's again, an amazing opportunity. Very much appreciate you guys. Thuggo says, why would England admit unskilled third world men without unless there is malice? Yeah, this is a question that frankly Tucker asked me, and I gave my best answer, but I'll pitch it to you. We understand why you might want to bring in a scientist or a doctor or a once in a generation musical talent or something like that. But all of our countries seem to be obsessed with bringing large numbers of military aged men who otherwise are basically unemployable. They can only do low skill manual labor, and simultaneously are trying to automate that labor out of existence. It seems pretty clear to anybody, I think, with a functioning brain, that is a recipe for disaster, and yet all of our leaders are committed to it. I can say that's just ideological, but do these people have no self-preservation? Is there what do you think is driving ultimately this desire, which seems almost suicidal?
Well, I think there are a number of factors to point to. I mean, one might be just a sense of kind of post-colonial guilt, that we've invaded the world. And so it's up now, the penalty that we pay is to invite the world and not put up any kind of barriers to it. That might have a kind of an imperial post-colonial sort of framing, or it might be, in the case of Germany, just a sense of, remember those signs that went up in the train stations in 2015 after Merkel kind of opened the borders, these big signs of the German word atonement. There's a sense that this is how we can finally chase away the ghosts of our Nazi past. I think another factor is probably going to be this sort of weird dogma of just line go up, Treasury finance department dogma of it doesn't matter. As long as we've got to keep the Ponzi scheme going, we've got to keep growing the pie, and we just ignore the fact that the slices of the pie are getting smaller and smaller. Even if they are kind of net drains, they're still kind of enlarging the economy, and that's fine. I mean, interestingly, my sense is here in Britain in the last 3 to 6 months, that mood is beginning to change. You're starting to see the kind of this phenomenon of elite defection. Even some quite prominent economists, and for example, the Office for Budget Responsibility just a few weeks ago, I think, said, look, this myth that migration is just always and everywhere an economic benefit is simply not true. And I think that has been a big change in British politics in the last year or so. Last year, 18 months, we've got this sense that migration's gone to the top of what matters most to voters. And then if you look at the issues underneath that matter, whether it's public services, housing, cost of living, the British public is waking up to the fact that these are not isolated issues. That if you're importing millions and millions of people who are going to be net drains on your economy, that's going to affect your schools, it's going to affect your hospitals, it's going to affect all public services, it's going to affect the cost of living. It is going to account for, I think, 80% of housing demand in the southeast. And so I think that lays the conditions for, if not regime change, we're not very good at regime change, unlike you guys, certainly, some sort of dramatic shifts in the future. What's the old joke that Americans say, what do we want? Revolution. When do we want it? Now. And the Brits, it's, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? In due course.
We've got Thea Siniga. Sorry, I always say it wrong. The motherland must be retaken. Bosch. That's there's I always forget that guy's name. He was on he was on like The Apprentice or something, right? The guy who's famous for making the videos being extremely happy and yelling Bosch at the end. I don't know. I'm trying to remember his name, but anyway, let's see here. We've got E. Curb again. He says, secular humanism ignores the biblical truth that man is sinful and the world is fallen. This faulty and naive anthropology forces radical immigrants and calls the fathers of raped girls racist. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the fact that the liberal anthropology is deeply flawed leads them to believe that they can just adopt these people and that there is no conflict and there is no real difference. Ultimately, the blank slate is something that I think drives people to make a lot of very bad decisions. I don't know if you have anything to say to that one.
No, I think the blank slateism has got a lot to answer for.
Paladin again, it says, funny how when asked what to do about a situation, we end up channeling Dee Snider and the Beastie Boys with the fighting for our rights to party, and we're not going to take it. I hope at some point we see more people actually channel that. As obviously James says, there is civil unrest in England, and nobody wants to see that. But at some point, you understand that this is, there has to be a cost. There has to be a cost for leaders who harm their people intentionally, and you want it to be civil, you want it to be peaceful, you want it to be within the tradition that allows you to change what's going on, but ultimately keeps your society intact. But if you keep pushing, eventually, one way or another, you will get to the end point where the people rising up and making a change is worth the cost, because what they're getting now is just so bleak that there's no other way to be heard, and that's what's going to happen. And then Creeper Weirdo says, why does the British left hate the Bosch guy? Okay, well, now I really need to remember his name, because the question is about the Bosch guy. Do you know who I'm talking about? Maybe it's Tony or something. He's always yelling. He's always talking about what chicken dinner he's cooking and having a bunch of beers with the guys. And he was on some reality TV show, and he's always saying Bosch at the end when he's trying to rally the British people to be excited about something. Do you know about this cultural phenomenon, or am I just...
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit there, Auron, but I'm happy to answer the question as it's stated on the text. Can you hear me okay still?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Yeah, I couldn't quite hear your sort of embellishment of the question, but this is about Thomas Skinner and
yes, that's him.
Why they can't stand just the uncomplicated expression of love for his missus and love for his kids and love for England without kind of politicizing the whole thing. I mean, Tom has become a good friend of mine over the last few months, and we had a wonderful barbecue with the vice president, with your vice president in the Cotswolds here last Monday. I insisted, I held a conference on, it's called Now and England, and invited Tom along because I wanted somebody who could speak of England. And I thought he's kind of England incarnate. He's Essex on legs. And he gave one of the most extraordinary speeches. And it wasn't right wing, it wasn't left wing. It was just this sort of passionate expression of love for England. And we were having a beer. We went for pints afterwards, and he turned to me and said, "You never guess what?" I said, "What's that, Tom?" "The vice president of the United States is following me on Twitter." I said, "Oh, really, Tom? That's amazing. Do you know, I think you really get on with the vice president." And he said, "Well, I mean, I'm never going to meet him, am I?" I said, "Well, let's have a selfie." I took a selfie. I sent it to the vice president. He got back to me straight away and said, "I love this guy. He's got so much positive energy. Social media is so negative, and he just is this gleaming light of uncomplicated patriotism and uxoriousness and love of family and faith in community." I said, "We've got to go for pints with this guy." And he was as good as his word.
Fantastic. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Let James get home. But make sure that you're following his work when his podcast comes out. Make sure that you are enjoying that as well. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, you need to subscribe on YouTube. Click the bell notifications so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And when you do, leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you once again, James. And as always, everyone, I'll talk to you next time.